Let's talk a little bit about a couple of recent developments that sort of are antithesis to one another. First of all, New York regulations. I think there's a law that is going to the Senate, the state Senate in New York, that's issues a moratorium on proof of work mining. Meanwhile, Fort Worth, Texas, is like pleb mining with a few miners in their city hall. So it's interesting to see these developments, and it's another, kind of beautiful aspect of the United States, where there's these 50 different states that can sort of test different policies and approaches to things, and people can make decisions based on those real world tests, etc. So any thoughts from you, Matthew, on this emerging trend of states experimenting with Bitcoin, what we're learning from that in terms of political support for mining in this particular case, or any other aspect of Bitcoin?
Yeah, and on that, I guess I have sort of kind of obvious interpretation, which is what you said, which is, you're going to have experiments. You're going to see certain states, drop the ball, and other states pick up the ball. And I see this as somewhat similar, although there's probably some nuances associated with like cannabis and cannabis legislation, right? There are certain states who were very early on, like the legalization wave, passed state laws. A lot of businesses got started there. And it took time for those to get momentum. It took time for kind of the national conversation around marijuana laws to shift. And you're still having kind of a challenge for those sort of advocates to get kind of a federal law passed. And it's kind of a challenge for that industry. But you can sort of see kind of as an analogous case of how kind of state by state approaches start to sort of generate their own momentum. Now, that being said, right, you would prefer there to be a more coherent approach to this industry, given that Bitcoin doesn't respect particular boundaries, right? It's a global asset. It's a global network. And the industries in the United States that we want to have sort of be sort of fostered and innovate on top of that, right, are going to have trouble if certain key states sort of block themselves off from that network. And yeah, they'll hurt themselves. But Bitcoin will continue chugging along. I do think you're going to see momentum, especially in the Bitcoin mining, right? So Bitcoin mining is itself kind of one of the most geographically and politically anchored aspects of the network, right? You have to find large power sources. You have to have local agreements. You have to pay local taxes. You have to get approvals and sites, and they're often the most tangible manifestations of the network, right? You've got big warehouses. You can do tours with hard hats, and politicians can show up. You've got jobs. You can point to something physical. And in certain jurisdictions, that's great. You can point to something physical. In other jurisdictions, right, because of sort of America has a very strong NIMBYist, not in my backyard strain. And it's not. And Bitcoin, I think, is just a new thing that's going to get caught up in that, right? There's lots of sort of public policy mistakes and weird irrational things that we've done with our land use, our economic development, our real estate kind of development that don't make a whole lot of rational economic sense, but that's just the nature of our political system. And I think, Bitcoin is gonna go through the same sort of matrix of constraint. I don't think net it's going to lead to any strategic challenges to it, right? Over the long term, I think some of the state by state things are going to get ironed out. But yeah, I mean, where you can, right, you can exert political pressure on local officials and say, hey, this is actually really good for our state. And I think in New York, you can talk to Troy Cross and Margaret. They basically say New York itself has one of the higher average in terms of renewable generation in the grid. And so if you kick miners out of New York and they relocate to a state grid that doesn't have as much renewable penetration, you're actually going to create more carbon emissions and not less. So if your policy objective is to reduce the carbon emissions associated with the Bitcoin network, you want to attract Bitcoin miners to where the amount of renewables.
It's not like it's going to prevent miners from operating to pass this law.
It's kind of productive, and a lot of it is mostly political signaling, not sort of rationally informed. And this is the challenge, right? We're trying to sort of get factual information into the hands of some of those legislators, but that's how the sausage is made, and sometimes it doesn't change minds, and it's that's the way the cookie crumbles.
Yeah. Any thoughts on state level adoption? U.S. state level adoption, David?
Yeah. I mean, thoughts. Broadly, I think there will be a sandbox, kind of like both of you alluded to, and it will be clear in time who benefits from what policies. And so, New York has often been kind of a policy leader in that they're willing to kind of test out and try more controversial and like novel policies. I think this could play out in, there's sort of two views you can take. Like, what one view is that this sets off like a chain reaction where every subsequent proof of work moratorium is marginally easier to justify than the prior because you can point to the one before it and say, well, New York did this, so it's reasonable, and we should do the same thing. We should follow New York. The other view you could take, is that people will wait and see, and what they will find, if I were, is that a lot of like Bitcoin capital leaves New York, it goes to Texas or goes to Wyoming, and so then you may have the states kind of are sitting there watching to see what happens, and they realize, oh hey, if we kind of moralize energy usage, because that was so bizarre about the New York stuff, is that they're not coming after fossil fuel plants. They're just saying that there are certain things that you can use fossil fuels for, and there are certain things that you cannot now use fossil fuels for, which is just super bizarre. And to Matthew's point, indicative of this being a lot more sort of symbolic and politically motivated rather than being policy or kind of outcome motivated. And so, yeah, maybe we see a lot of capital leave New York, and they kind of fall on their sword, so no other state has to. I mean, we'll just have to see how it plays out. But broadly, it's definitely good that states can experiment. That some are going to be a lot more bullish on Bitcoin, others are not. And I think that as states continue to see the upside of pro-Bitcoin policy, if we start to see states, passing laws that say, we will not allow for the, infringement of your right to self-custody, if we will allow you to, whatever. I mean, basically, whatever kind of laws or lack of regulations that attract capital and Bitcoin talent, I do think that gets a little bit of a snowball effect, where the states that are early in their support of Bitcoin reap outsized gains, and everyone else kind of like FOMOs in, reminiscent of Bitcoin itself. So I think it is also, for the same reason, good that states have the opportunity to really screw up their Bitcoin policy, because I'd rather a state do it and kind of have that empirical example to learn from, rather than the federal government, for example, messing up in a substantive way on Bitcoin policy, because that's going to be a lot more impactful, a lot harder to backtrack from, and the kind of signaling and spillover effects of nationally harmful policy are just much more substantial than that of state policy, a sort of policy leader state like New York, where a lot of eyes are kind of watching them to see what they do.